Awesome, and we're live. Hi everyone, thank you for joining us. Wow, if I didn't work with you, I would really have questions. Anyway, thank you for being here in spite of the weather and other things that have been happening. Thank you for making the time to be here. We are honored to have Dr. Claire with us. I always put the doctor before her name because she did school for a really long time. She not only deserves it, but you earned it. So forever, we'll call you Dr. Claire. I don't know how, even if we were best friends, I'd be like, so Dr. Claire. Anyway, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Thank you for saying yes. We're very excited.
Given that I've been on the audience end a lot more than ever being here, it's like, I'm like, wow, I graduated. Wow.
I mean, you have a lot of episodes. You need to graduate at some point, right? So I always start my conversations by asking my guests, please introduce yourself to us as if we are people who do not know anything about you.
So hi everyone, my name is Dr. Claire Kinuthia. First of all, I am a consultant obstetrician gynecologist, so that's the day job, primarily sexual reproductive health. Then now podcaster with Circling the Rabbit Hole podcast. Primary focus there again, sexual reproductive health as well as related mental health. And then, what else do I do? Digital things, social media, digital marketing, all the great things that come with being a face people are used to seeing online. And then finally, a traveler, every chance I get, and cat mom.
We love a cat parent in this space. That's really exciting. So you mentioned the name of your podcast, Circling the Rabbit Hole. I find it very interesting. So what is the origin of your podcast's name?
It came from a brainstorming session with one of the first people I told I wanted to start a podcast. The term that we usually use is going down the rabbit hole, Alice in Wonderland reference, which is just what you do every time you open Google. You start somewhere and next thing you know, 3 hours went by and you've been reading stuff continuously or watching things continuously. So given that the topics we discuss are considered taboo, they're considered to be problematic, culturally people don't like to talk about much as sexual or reproductive health. So the thought behind the name is we'll bring you to the edge of the rabbit hole, so literally circling, and then hopefully once you dip your toe, you fall in and you learn as much as you can on the topics.
Amazing. That's really cool.
Yeah.
That's really, really cool.
I tend to be geeky, so there's always a thought process behind these things.
I appreciate geekiness, especially when it has Alice in Wonderland references. So what inspired you to start the podcast? What is it that made you think, okay, sexual and reproductive health, why the focus on women also?
Conversations I was having with my patients. I feel like most of the times you decide to start something, it's because it's informed by your experiences. And in clinic, we're dealing with issues that should have been addressed from the very basics, with things like sexual health issues, reproductive health issues should have been covered in sex ed, comprehensive sex education. But as we know, in our country, and
What is that?
and also I think a lot of countries in general still haven't embraced comprehensive sex ed. So then I would be having very, very basic conversations instead of explaining. So you've come in with one issue, but I'm having to teach you basic anatomy, basic physiology of your body. And then I'd have these conversations on repeat and find myself having these conversations with women who are older. So by the time I'm teaching you the basics and you're in your 40s and 50s, there's clearly been a gap. So that's where it started from. And I thought if we don't have the information, then I can't, it limits how we're able to look after our patients as gynecologists, as doctors in general. So I thought that's a good place to start with information sharing. And over time, then the podcast idea came into play.
Okay, so you've touched both on your colleagues and patients, right? So what is it that made you, or who was your ideal, I guess, audience member when you were starting the podcast?
It literally both, because we have gaps in both. We have gaps in fully understanding for doctors, fully understanding how to care for our patients and learning how to listen, because we've always had a system where the doctor is always right. It's sort of like a God complex scenario. You come in, I barely look at you, I write a prescription and off you go. So there's a bit of educating amongst ourselves as well that I felt was necessary, as well as now the audience in general who are now make up the patient population. Yeah.
How do you draw the balance between the two audiences? Because I feel like for doctors, you have your own language, you have your own, all of these things, but then if you're speaking to me as a would-be patient, there's certain things that I would not understand, terminologies and things like that. Like you say, there's the version that has the God complex and the understanding versus me who's just like, the what? So how do you draw the balance between the two audiences that you have for your podcast?
I think that's what informed the format of the podcast. So prior to starting, everything I researched to do with medical healthcare related podcasts was teacher mode. So doctor to camera, teaching the audience. And I felt like that takes away from what I'm trying to achieve. So that's where we harness the power of storytelling so that my guests will share their experiences and then we learn from those experiences. And a lot of times I'll also bring experts on as a guest so that we discuss the topic holistically. So there's understanding the challenge and then understanding what needs to be done to help with the issue. In terms of language, we try and keep it as simple as possible. Speak English. And then a lot of the times I translate. When I have healthcare providers on set, I will translate for the audience because there's a tendency to go into the jargon. So because we understand the jargon as doctors, I don't need to speak in jargon. They will translate. But it's also sort of like a hope that as you listen to the podcast as a provider, you also learn how to speak to patients in a language that they'll be able to appreciate and understand.
Okay. What is it that made you decide to, in creating your podcast, draw on your profession? Like, why not just, well, like I said earlier, I have a podcast with my sisters. Why not just do that, like with, say, your brother or something like that? Like, what is it that made you draw on your profession specifically?
Maybe my personality. So I'm not a person to be on set or stage. Amanda is here, my assistant, and she'll tell you I'm rubbish. So even this is not my natural habitat. I'm very good with one-on-one with my patients. So it's not supposed to be about me. It's not about the person per se. It's literally putting out information and correcting misinformation that's available. The work we've done so far, we've ended up being considered one of the health influencers by the WHO, just because you're trying to make sure there's enough information. Every time someone Googles, you're not going to stop people from Googling, but every time you look something up, you should hopefully find accurate information first before you find misinformation. So it took putting myself out there really uncomfortably to get that done. It's not supposed to be, I mean, maybe along the way I'll get more comfortable and, okay, that's a lie. I'll never overshare. So I just caught myself. No, it's very unlikely. But more and more I feel the more comfortable I get, the more it translates onto the episodes. But then it's not supposed to be focused. I'm not trying to be a celebrity. It's not about me. I would hope that you're learning something from the episodes and you're able to share and most importantly, start conversations. You can watch an episode. And I think the best feedback I've had is moms who'll say, I watched this with my daughter, and because of this episode, we were able to have a proper conversation for the first time about her period, about puberty, and that for me is the win.
Amazing. I really like when you can get feedback from your audience, especially when you see that you're making an impact. I'm curious about your patient's reaction to your podcast. Like you're saying now, you're getting to a point where you're recognized by people like WHO and organizations like that. So what was your patients, what was their response to you having a podcast? And has it brought more people on as patients?
Yes, it has brought more people on. I get lots of requests for like clinic information. The DMs are full of those requests a lot of the time because people then feel like, because I saw you discussing this, then you know about it. So it's a good place to start. Sometimes even for things that have nothing to do with what I do in terms of sexual reproductive health, but then I'm able to refer up accordingly. So I think that's a huge plus. Reaction from my patients. There are some who walk in and start shouting celebrity doctor and bring their friends and refer people based off of episodes as well. So I think it translates very well between the two in terms of the day job and the side hustle.
Okay, now, in it being a side hustle and you doing your job, how do you remain accessible to both spaces? Because I feel like as a podcaster, you're a point of information. Like you're saying, there are people in the DMs asking questions to you. You've created a brand. And then as a doctor, it's people coming to you as a patient. It's a very different type of relationship. How do you strike the balance between the two?
They're very different worlds, to be fair. So for me, it's scheduling. So I have podcast day and I have clinic day. So it's that simple. So it's not really confusing. I find that the podcast also helps in terms of a reference point because in a consult, it's unlikely that I'll have enough time to discuss every single detail. But if we've had an episode, I'll refer you to go watch it and get as much info. And then based off of that, you can research a bit more. So it's very clear cut. I have very clear different days or different types of days. Yeah.
How has the podcast impacted your practice very specifically, if at all?
Again, just, I guess, more patience as well. Sort of, it comes, I guess it's the side effect, but you sort of end up being the thought leader on the topics because this is the first face we know when you're talking about SRHR. If you're looking for doctors who understand certain conditions, then you'll hear someone say, go watch this episode of this podcast, Dr. Claire talked about this and that. So it has that kind of a direct impact in terms of which patients I'll end up seeing. It also informs the ones I won't.
Interesting.
Yeah, because SRHR is a very, like I said, it tends to be taboo. And there are people who are very hard set, super religious, politics. There's a lot that comes into play. So I tend to be very vocal about my own belief systems. But then at the same time, I'm very clear that personal versus professional are there's supposed to be a very clear divide. So there are people who will see that I'll talk about certain topics and they disagree with it. And so they won't look for me as a doctor, which is fine. But then I also want to be clear that I'm a safe space for those who don't know where else to go. Yeah.
Okay. We titled this conversation Podcasting for Business. And I wanted to speak to you specifically because as a doctor, as you've mentioned, it makes you a thought leader. It puts you at a certain position that you're able to get different patients or new patients you'd never have gotten to the space. So based on your experience in that space, what would be your advice, I think, for someone who wants to start a podcast in whatever profession they're in approaching the balance between the two, the starting of it, and maybe even what like your peers thought about it and how to go around that?
Okay. I think just from experience, I'd say if you're interested, just start. I'm pro-Gadoni on that narrative because if you overthink it, you're not going to start. If you complicate it, it's not something you're going to end up doing. So I'd say if you're interested, research, learn what a podcast is and how it works, because that's a skill set on its own, and then just get started. But then I'd say you need to be clear on what your mission is, maybe, because even if it's focused on bringing more business, what exactly about your business do you want to highlight? Is it, and especially professionals, is it what you do as a professional directly, or is it what services you provide? Are you trying to be purely service or product driven, or are you trying to be a thought leader on a topic? So you have to really be clear so that what you do doesn't end up confusing the audience. at the same time, maybe at the beginning, be playful with it a bit, experiment a bit, because you never really know what your idea will translate to and what the audience will end up resonating with. Yeah, so be open to experimenting. Don't try to be a perfectionist. That's me working against my own personality. And then my motto with podcasting is fail fast and fail forward. So I don't have time to dilly-dally. If part of the team isn't working, we need to keep moving. If someone isn't on the same page, it's fine. Let's keep it moving so that at the end of the day, honestly, it's a lot of work. So I can't be managing too many moving parts. So if something isn't working, we need to brainstorm, figure it out, change it as soon as possible, and then play it out and see if that change actually translates to being productive at the end of the day.
Okay. What are some of the changes you've had to make from when you started to now, based on your podcast, around your business?
For the podcast specifically, the big one is time. So how often we release episodes, that's the biggest one we've had. Initially it was every week, but then we do tend to carry very heavy topics. So it felt almost like it was too much, too quick. So then we've changed it to every fortnight, so every 2 weeks. And that's translated really well. We have a lot more audience engagement. We have a lot more feedback. We have a lot more conversation around the topic of that time, of the 2 weeks. So I think that's been the biggest one. In-house, there's a lot of team member shuffling. Because again, sometimes it's just not a good fit. Sometimes ideas are clashing. Sometimes it's not even has to do with me. It's literally amongst team members. It's just not working. So you kind of have to assess and decide what's working, what's not. And then that's where the cutthroat side comes in.
Okay, it's not fun to podcast either. Okay, so when it comes to your peers, what has the feedback been from them?
The doctors will tell you it's an interesting place to be when you find your face on any screen. Let me put it like that. When you find yourself online in any way, the feedback is very mixed. So the audience and the patients appreciate it because now we're learning from an expert in the field. Then your colleagues don't like it because then you're embarrassing us. You're too out there. We're still very much in the 70s in terms of mindset around medicine. So why would you put yourself out there like that? Trade secrets. Those are things they should learn when they come to see you in a consultation. There's also you're too loud, you're too brash. I mean, my hair, everything about me says too much. But then I think we've come a long way as well because we do have lots of doctors now who've embraced literally just being like your audience and fitting in, and because being relatable is important, especially since this is a service that a lot of the times is very, very personal, especially so like in my field. So that, I guess the back and forth, it's confusing to some extent because if you see me in hospital and the response I'll get from colleagues, it's very, very different, polar opposite of what happens out in the streets. So where you'll have people coming up to you and saying, oh my God, that episode changed my life. This is the first time somebody put a name to what I've been feeling. You go to work and it's the complete opposite. Oh, who does she think she is? Oh, why is she telling all the secrets? Oh. So it tends to be, you have to thick skin a little bit, but then you also have to decide what's important at the end of the day. And then accept yes, it'll take them longer to catch on, but accept that they will, and they will copy, and they will take shortcuts, and they'll come to you asking for, okay, I'm starting, so tell me how to do things. So it's just about accepting that maybe sometimes you might be ahead of time with what you're doing, and then let the process just play out.
Amazing. So you brought up something in your previous answer, talking about sometimes your peers will be like, you give them information that they should get in the consult. How do you draw the balance between giving information to your patient and losing business? Because if I could have paid you 1,000, 2,000, whatever it is for a consult to get the information, how do you draw the balance between, I guess, stealing from yourself or whatever it would be in business?
Yeah.
What should a business professional think about in that space?
So in terms of medicine, it's very clear for me. I'm not giving you treatment plans. I'm not treating the condition that you have. I'm never going to advise general public that if you have XYZ diagnosis, this is what the treatment plan should be, and that's where it's clear. What you need is information. You need to understand, if I have this diagnosis, what does it mean to me? Are there things I can do for myself to get my symptoms under control? So lifestyle changes, the basics. But it'll never be that I start naming drugs and giving you prescriptions. It doesn't work like that. And then you also have to be clear with the audience when they reach out, because a lot of the feedback is, okay, I get paragraphs, this is what I have, these are the symptoms, so what do you think I should do? I'm like, yeah, this is a consult. Mm-hmm. And if you want to consult, it doesn't have to be me, but you need to go see your doctor. So I think, I guess in other fields, they can apply it the same way, because you know what your service is or what you're actually providing. You don't need to give that away. And a lot of times it's unethical, because for us that would be completely unethical. Right. So you just need to have clarity, like I said right at the beginning. Just know exactly what it is you want to come out of, or the messaging that's coming out of the podcast that you're creating, and then run with that message.
Okay. Now, you said sometimes your people will come in, your colleagues will come, and they'll give us the information. How do I start a podcast? How do you set yourself apart when everyone in your business has decided that what you're doing is the thing I want to do, right? What is it or what are the things you tell someone to set themselves apart from their peers in the same space?
Oh, that's a good question. I actually have to think. I think a lot of it will be with how you execute. That's where your individuality will shine. Because again, just like with anything else that you do on socials, your authenticity has to come out, and you as an individual and how you're approaching things and how you're doing things is where there'll be a difference. So the styling of the podcast, the type of guests you'll have on, the topics, the conversations, all of that will vary. And even if you sat me and another gynecologist together, the way we execute will be very different. So I think that's the key. Sprinkle in a little bit of yourself into what you're doing.
Okay, and how do I stay relevant in the topics I cover? Because a lot of things might change often, but then how do I not stay talking about the same thing all the time, and then stay relevant outside, not just in my profession, but to the audience?
From experience, I think staying relevant is usually just paying attention to what's happening. So what are the hot topics at the time in your industry? What exactly are people looking up? What are people interested in? What's relevant? Because again, if, for example, when we've been talking so much about femicide, if I've never addressed it, it's like, are you crazy? Do you live in a bubble? So you kind of have to pay attention to what's happening around you. And then researching, for us in healthcare, it tends to be a little easier because we have awareness months. We have awareness days for certain conditions. So we'll sort of also plug into that as just timing for which episode comes out when. And I guess feedback as well from the audience, because I do get, now I have feedback in the sense of someone will reach out and say, this is the work I do, this is what I'm suffering from or whatever. I think it would be a good topic for the podcast. So then reach out to them and host them probably. Others, it'll be, I have more questions and they ask questions and you go like, okay, maybe we did cover, because sometimes you will redo the same topic. Yeah. But we covered it in one way and now we're covering it in a different style. So it just has to be that you're plugging into the environment around you and getting feedback. If your audience is primarily Kenyan, translate to Kenyan, like things that people can understand. If it's not, if it's a bit more integrated or mixed, just look at what is relevant to the different audience members.
Amazing. Mm-hmm. So, on your podcast, when it comes to business, you told us about having thought leadership or different things. What's the approach that you use on your podcast?
For me, it's, again, because it was informed by picking up a gap in terms of lack of information, the primary thing for us is putting out relevant information on topics that people don't otherwise discuss. And so it puts us in sometimes very uncomfortable situations, because then you have someone who's gone through horrible abuse come on as a guest, and you all have to debrief properly after shooting that episode. You have topics where people will be shy about talking about it. We're also looking at those who want to stay anonymous. How will we address that? So moving forward, there's lots of different aspects you have to think through. But I think if you are paying attention, you'll be able to catch and change and do what you need to do to make it applicable for, again, industry. So I will talk heavy on medicine because that's all I know. Yeah, but I think this can be translated to all sorts of different types of business or industry thought leaders. So it doesn't necessarily have to be, I actually don't think thought leaders decide that they are thought leaders themselves. Sure. I think it's the audience.
If they do, they're wrong.
Yeah, there's something wrong there. So it will just come up as, if you're knowledgeable, share the information that you have, keep researching. Medicine is a good, for me, it tends to create a good foundation, because we are constantly studying, we're constantly learning. Research is constantly coming up that's showing, the evidence shows that sometimes we were wrong in the past, and now we're having to change treatment approaches. So I apply the same to podcasting. So if I did an episode, for example, on endometriosis last year, and then I read a paper and the evidence has changed, I must update my audience. So that's how to just stay relevant and accurate with the information that you're sharing.
Okay. Now, if I was to start a business podcast and come to you to ask you for 3 tips that would help me be able to figure out podcasting while being a professional, what would your 3 tips be?
The first one, learn how every part works, how every single side of podcasting works, from production to styling to scripting to sourcing guests to getting your guests comfortable on set, all of it. Learn, get your hands dirty. Don't outsource right off the bat, just so that you then have a clear vision of what you want and what you expect from your teams. Because if you have no idea, first of all, you'll get played. Yo. Yo, yeah.
Talking from experience.
Yo. Because then you'll be made to believe things are not possible when they are, or things are more expensive than they are. So you kind of have to get your hands dirty, get to know each and every part, and then, like for me, quickly decide what I don't like to do, and I outsource. Because you don't have to do it all. And then if you're bringing in teams, that helps you be very clear on your vision so that they can translate it for you, because no one else can do what you have as a vision in your head. So I think, first of all, get your hands dirty, get to know the ins and outs and the workings of, because again, also professionals, the way we are in medicine and the way production works are polar opposites. It's been one of the most eye-opening for me, because what seems to make sense in my head, I don't have the language for the production team, and then they're like, what exactly are you saying? What do you want? How do you want this to come off? So be open to learning, and the quicker you learn, the easier it is to outsource as well. I think now it's a lot easier to start because there's lots of, are they production houses or like podcast places, locations where you can shoot. You have teams who actually shoot for podcasts. So I think it's a little bit easier. So you can do your research and decide who you'd like to work with. The second one I'd say is, like I said, fail very fast and fail forward. Don't get stuck. If something isn't working, release, move forward. Because I think that's one of the ways it'll make it easier, because it's easy to give up. Podcasting is hard work. It's really easy to it's easy to take breaks between seasons and go like one whole year and I didn't do a single episode. I know I'm speaking to a few people.
I feel attacked. Thank you very much.
So if you want to make it, just try and make it as easy as you can. Streamline as much as you can so that you're doing what you need to do to make sure your episodes come out as you've said you'd want them to come out. Number 3. I think branding is important. You need to be very, very clear on whether the podcast is branded around you as an individual or your business or your product so that you stop getting blurred lines between them. Because especially if you are hosting a podcast, it's easy for it to become confusing between Claire the person and Dr. Claire versus the podcast host. So you kind of need to be clear on what the brand is, even from the beginning. And even as you're learning, you'll streamline and detach some areas of yourself. You'll be very clear of what you share and what you don't share. And along the way, you'll also give yourself a bit of leeway for experimentation.
If it's professional, what are your thoughts around it? What was your growth towards it and the thought towards that? And what would your advice be around that?
For me, I think it was informed by my environment. Just generally speaking, Kenyans prefer to watch than they do to listen. And this is even on a personal level. So the idea of having something just purely audio would have struggled quite a bit to reach the audience that we're trying to reach, especially so because the younger audience are a big player for us. So just being audio just purely audio wasn't going to work very well. So I think you also have to assess, based on the industry and the business, what is likely to work better. I don't know if things have changed, but we still don't really have as much listenership as we do viewership, even when we do our stats internally. So I think for me, that was just informed by where this podcast is. Yeah.
Okay. And marketing. You talked about having a separation between Claire. I'll only call you that because you said it yourself. Claire, Dr. Claire, and like the podcast host, right? Mm-hmm. How do you determine how to separate those? So say on social media, you have your page, you have the podcast page. Is it important to have both, based on your experience, of course? And what do you think the considerations should be when it comes to marketing the podcast in that sense?
I think if you're starting, so it depends, first of all, it depends on, first, if you're even comfortable on being on social media, because my personal brand preceded the podcast. So for me, it was more of, I had a resistance to have a podcast page. That was my experience, because I was like, I'm running a page. I'm running hundreds of pages at this point. Why am I adding more to my workload? So for me, I got to the point where I realized I need somewhere for the podcast to just sit as the podcast, and then different platforms, different approach. Because on Instagram, I have both mine and the podcast. On TikTok, I believe it's branded for me, but then it's primarily podcast content. So it just depends on also audience and how much bandwidth you have for running all these different personalities and brands, and how big your team is. So if you're still just by yourself, you can make that decision and say, to start with, I will just purely do the podcast and brand for the podcast. And then if you don't have to have a personal profile, over time, probably it will become necessary, because then your audience is kind of curious about who you are as a person, so you can then bring up your own pages. But I think it's a very personal decision from one person to the next, because you don't need to feel pressure to have an appearance for yourself. You don't have to open page, because I've had that conversation with medical professionals, and like I said, majority of us, type A's, are very uncomfortable with the limelight. So they'll ask, do I have to have a personal page like you? And then if I'm doing a podcast, if I'm doing like a series or a show or whatever, have that page separate? And I'm like, whatever you're comfortable with. If all you want your identity online to be is just whatever your product is or the service is, then that's all you need to do.
Okay. From your podcast, are there certain ways that you have managed to interact with your audience outside of the podcast and outside of them being your patients?
Not yet.
Okay.
Not yet. We'll grow there, because I also think we're a very niche product. It's a very, very specific topics that we cover, very specific part of people's lives. So I don't approach it the same way you'd approach a personality-based podcast, where you can have events and you run just for meet and greets and the likes. Because for me, I'm like, what are you meeting me for? if I was
Well,
honest.
also newsletters and things like that is
Right,
around the
right.
time where I was,
Yeah.
that's maybe the space. But you're right, it makes it difficult for you. Though it
Yeah.
would be a very good show to do as a live.
So
as
yeah,
well.
so that's what my team is convincing me to build towards.
Excellent. You've spoken about your team a lot. And you talked about having that you need to be able to understand everything in the podcast world before. So I want to ask about your journey specifically. Like, how did you start? What made you get a team? What's the thing you didn't like that made you decide, okay, I need someone for this thing? And how did it help your podcast, if it did at all?
So my journey in full precedes the podcast. So when I started off, I started with blogging. This is many years ago now. It makes me feel old to even think about. But back when people were reading, I started with a blog. Now, not so much. So it started with blogging, and then in fact, I think when I started is when Instagram came up, because initially it was just Twitter and Facebook. So then learning how to translate blog posts to visual for Instagram was the next skill that I developed. And then growing that over time into what we called 5-Minute Fridays. It was an IGTV series.
Throwback.
God, my age though. So translating that into a little mini-sodes type of thing on Instagram, and then now coming into the podcast. So I think over time, it's just evolved naturally. So I didn't necessarily learn everything on the podcast, like production, how to set up your set, how to set down, how to shoot, how to edit. I had to do that for myself during the rest of the journey. And I quickly learned I don't like that part at all. Because the hours it would take for me to set up, figure out where the cameras should be, where my seats should be, focusing, because you'd shoot a whole 5 minutes episode and then nothing. It's all blurred, there's no sound. It was just chaotic. So I was able to learn from that experience enough to know that if I'm starting a podcast, I need a team for that. Because I know how I want it shot. I've done that bit. And now when I'm bringing them on board, it's very easy to translate the vision through them. The next part was styling. Okay. That was another journey in itself. So again, from shooting myself and deciding what I'm wearing and, hair, makeup, blah, blah. Of course, now when I get to the podcast, I'm like, so, see, there are people who do this for a living. Why? What am I proving? So again, I think the journey preceding the podcast actually informed a lot that we've ended up translating on the podcast. So the team I've created are helping me do the things that, because of trial and error, I now know I don't want to, but also I don't think I have the capacity for, because remember, I'm still working full-time as an obstetrician gynae. And I also want to be more focused on what's important, which is what's the episode about, who are the guests we are bringing on board, how will we set up the conversation, what questions, so the scripting and everything. And then also that also has reduced, because then I brought on Amanda, my assistant, because then I'm like, I don't like watching myself. I actually just don't. So once the episode is shot, she watches and edits things and tells the team, no, this needs to be scrapped and you need to work on this. And then picking out the timestamps for what goes on social media. Because then I'm like, this repetitive listening to myself just makes me feel, it's weird. So it's been just learning through experiences. And I think we're still in the process of streamlining, because there's also still things I feel like I should have more people on board for. So like social media and actually making that a bit more clean and professional. So maybe next year, bring someone on board.
Okay, a question I'm sure that will come from the audience. I'm coming to you for questions, by the way. Is how do you sustain it where you're having a team, you're paying them? How are you making money from the podcast? Have you budgeted from yourself? Like, how do you sustain the podcast as it exists, not wanting to be an influencer, celebrity, something? So how do you break the balance between the two?
Learning my industry. When I started by drafting what I wanted for the podcast. How did I want it to look? I'm talking about stylist and makeup and, a production team. All that will cost money that I don't have. So then I had to sit down and think, okay, funding. And because of the topics, because of who we are as the podcast, it wasn't too hard to reach out to then industry players, let me say it like that, who are interested in helping with the funding, so that then we can be able to, get the information out there, because it's all about the information. It's not about, again, if I could skip the me part, I would. And it's in the works somewhere along the line. But definitely, for sure, funding is a huge limitation for when you start podcasting. So you have to really think about what your sources will be. For me, it's been funding through different industry players. Now I also combine the social media aspect, so that's where my personal brand comes in, because then I'll do work, speaking engagements, and what do you call it online? Digital marketing type of experiences, campaigns, and the likes with different industry players, so that it's still relevant to medicine. It's very unlikely you will see me do a sunlight ad or a car ad, or it's very unlikely, because it has nothing to do with what I'm doing. So I'm still very, very picky on what I say yes to. Also being careful at the same time, because the same industry will reach out for me to push products, which I can't do. Because again, it's medical, we're not playing ethics. Ethics is very clear. So think about the source or how you can raise your income. I think a lot of it was also conversations with people who've done it before me, or who've made their podcast a business, so that then I needed to learn, okay, so do podcasts first of all, I didn't even know that you can make money with a podcast, and then how. So ad revenue, different platforms and how they will engage with pay-per-view, I guess, is the approach. And then also now looking at partnerships, campaigns, working on campaigns, creating a platform that then we can highlight certain industry players, but then it also generates an income for us. So there's all of those different aspects at play for CTRH.
Okay, how do you determine who you should approach? So I have a podcast on podcasting, because that's my industry. How do I determine who in the podcasting industry or otherwise I should approach for funding? And what are the considerations I should have in place that you had in place? For example, when you were going to the first person who was funding you, what are the things you went to them with that made them go, oh yeah, here's some money?
I think like with anything else, especially those people who write grants or look for funding regularly, you just need to know how to align to them as well as to what you want to achieve. But you also have to be very clear on your absolute no's, because I'm not selling myself for anything. So even with the podcast, I'm making decisions around funding that will not influence the output of the podcast. So if I come out to be on sexual reproductive health, I should not one day wake up and start talking about anything irrelevant to those topics, basically. Let me not pinpoint. I'm having flashbacks.
You thought of someone specific?
So I think it's a balance, striking a balance. And then it's also a judgment call, because some offers are really yummy when you look at them and you're like, ooh, great. And then you read fine print and you go, well, no, maybe that's not, maybe not yet. Maybe it's too much of an influence. Maybe you have too much say in the back end of how the podcast works. So a lot of it for me has been gut feeling, and also just being careful with reading the fine details of contracts. Yeah.
Read your contracts. Speaking arrangements, how do you set yourself up as a thought leader who is considered by the people who are setting up these things to then be like, oh yeah, Dr. Claire, let me call her? Is that the approach, or should it be cold emails from me to the people who I think would fit with me?
I don't have either experience. I guess luckily for me, it's people coming to me for these engagements, because again, my focus is information sharing. So if I come off as something that's a good fit for the person or the event or the industry they're in, then they reach out to me. So I haven't yet, I don't really have experience with seeking out. I'm hoping to push myself, because again, comfort zone, guys. Those are things where I'm not yet comfortable. But then next year I have plans. We have to plan things. And like I said, my team pushed me, so I get out of my comfort zone. So I'm hoping to then now learn how to pitch decks, whatever that is, learn how to create those and have those conversations. But so far, it's been companies and people reaching out to me, and then we squabble over the money, because that always happens, and then now work with those who it's a good fit, and then decline the ones that don't work out.
Excellent. My last question to you before I go to the audience is, if you could go back in time and talk to Dr. Claire, the podcaster, what are the things you'd tell her about striking the balance between Dr. Claire and Dr. Claire, the podcaster?
Another good question. It's a tricky one, again, because of the way my journey has translated, because I think I had worked out, I was very clear about what the podcast is about and who I am on the podcast by the time I was thinking about having a podcast, from prior experience with everything else I've done online. I don't know how to answer that one. I don't know.
Okay, I'll let you think about it.
I need to think about that.
Does anyone have a question on podcasting, business podcasting, anything like that? Dear audience, we're coming to you. Any questions? No questions? Oh, I see a hand. Okay. I see two hands.
Yes, thank you. So you mentioned one thing that I found very interesting, which is, I think, related to saying no, aligning your vision and what you allow the podcast to become. Could you tell us more about that?
I think it's one of the hardest, toughest lessons along the way, is what to say yes to and what to say no to, and also more so further down the conversation. So not right at the beginning. So people reach out, or you go out and engage to get a partnership going, and then the conversation continues, and you start to see a few red flags here and there, and then the conversation continues further, and then the money gets smaller, but the terms get bigger. And so by the time you're saying no, it's tough, because then it's like a carrot was dangling in front of your face. And then also, the tougher part after that is then seeing your colleague or someone doing something similar jump onto that same campaign. So I think my lesson along the way was just and it's going to sound so cliche, this is such an Instagram quote, but what's meant for you is meant for you. It will not pass you. Because along the way, every time I've said no, I've had maybe 3 or 4 better yeses. So.
Yes, Kevin.
I had a question. How do you make sure, because like, as podcasts evolve, like sometimes your audience tells you what it is that they need. How do you actively engage your audience, if you do at all, in order to make sure that you're giving them information that they need and that they can use?
So far, we've basically been more on the responsive end. So they reach out and we respond to, rather than putting out anything actively. But we've just set up our website as well. So we want to engage more and maybe like have a newsletter and have feedback that will help inform a lot of the conversations that are coming in the next episodes. But I haven't yet actively reached out to audience in terms of looking for feedback. It tends to be what we're getting organically right now.
Yes.
I have 2. One, how do you deal with the contention? Like, I know you're out there to give the right information, but there's values, morality, and a lot of Deputy Jesus is around. So how do you deal with that? And also just want to know, does viewership or listenership equate to profitability?
Those are very good questions. The first one, I've been practicing for a very long time. And when you practice in SRHR on a day-to-day, first of all, you develop thick skin. So I truly, truly don't care. I wish I had a different answer. But the effect of some of these decisions that we make on other people's lives, I deal with directly. So it comes from a point of you don't even know what you're talking about. As you make rules for other people, you've never lived their experience. So I'm not too sure I can engage with you on that. It has nothing to do with you. And it's not a me thing, that's on you. So I don't have much of a challenge with that one, if I'm honest. And I think it's because of practicing. Because I practice and I actually look after people who are living through some of the worst things to do with everything horrible that you can have from not having adequate information to protect themselves. So then you telling me that it's bad to give information, I'm like, yeah, just sit down. Sit down. Second question. Wait, I forgot. All right, so that's a good one. In terms of, we tend to have especially a strong, strong belief, I think, within the Kenyan community that the more followers, the more views, the more, the better. And I don't think that's necessarily true, because especially so, it depends on your industry and what you're about. Because I think numbers count in certain types of industry. If you're an entertainer, then of course, the more the better. But then if I'm a doctor and I'm focused on informing, why do I care about the numbers per se, right? Because it's the quality that you're putting out there, the engagement, the effect it's having, that is actually translated. And the value is attached off of that, because in your industry, the industry players can see what's relevant. It's not necessarily translated by the layman outside of your industry. So I think if you're focused on industry and you're getting feedback and you're able to work within, create your networks within your industry, it's not really necessarily about the numbers. I know people who are doing amazing work and barely have an Instagram page. So it's not necessarily true.
Yeah, I agree. I think your niche determines your profitability. How well you can place yourself in the industry and determine how to position yourself, that will determine how you make the money. Because there's people who, I know when we were doing the monetization conversation, Salam and Hello, I think had 700 and something subscribers, but they had a brand signed on for a whole season of the podcast. So it's not about your numbers, it's about who you are, your positioning, and how you present yourself. Yeah. I see a hand.
Hi. So I think my question has partly been answered by the response just now, but I wanted to hear your thinking around what marketing channels you're using, because traditionally, and maybe that's the problem, you would imagine that for business pages, or professional services, then LinkedIn would be like a great avenue for, putting yourself out there, and especially because of the point of view of having funders, so that like getting in front of the not-for-profit sector, that would be a good place. But I only heard you mention TikTok and Instagram, so I'm wondering what your thinking is around that, or if you have tried, or what your thoughts are for your podcast. Yeah.
So again, with me, I work with my strengths. I barely open LinkedIn. My God, I have a profile because you're supposed to have a profile. And I know it works for a lot of people, but for me, I haven't yet even attempted to use it to its full capacity, I don't think, because I already feel like the ones I'm managing is a lot. And that's why I said I probably need to bring in someone focused primarily on social media, because then they can maximize on all the different platforms. But I find more value in, because we are here, we are people, I find more value in your network. And and I'm not a people person, I'm saying this as a person who likes to be at home with my cats, but you need to get to meet the right people. Put yourself in those spaces, because then I've had a lot of success with people I met during like a forum like this, and we then had a side conversation, and then it led to a coffee, and then we worked together. my initial funding came in that kind of a setup where I was invited as a speaker, then we had a side chat after, and then led to funding. So I don't think, it just depends on what your strengths are, but I think you'll have a lot more from the relationships you form and putting yourself out there even when it's uncomfortable, because for me, I can tell you it's not natural at all. Yeah.
Any more questions?
And I think also I'll say you don't necessarily have to be on every platform. Please just calm down.
Correct. Any other questions?
Thank you. I was just about to start yelling. Anyway, mine is more of like from an entertainment perspective as opposed to professional, because we just started our podcast this year, and one thing I've noticed is that especially in Kenya, a lot of entertainment type podcasters, unless they have, I shouldn't call it a celebrity, but someone who's well known socially, are not taken as seriously as more, professional type podcasts. And that is really, really sad, because rest is also revolutionary. We need to also do things for fun, for, our own mental and physical health even. So just based on that, as you said, putting yourself out there, obviously how you put yourself out there professionally and how you put yourself out there as more of an entertainer are two completely different things. Is that something you struggle with? Because I'm sure as much as, your podcast is based a lot more on your field of practice, there's also like a type of personableness, considering the topics that you talk about. People need to be comfortable, people need to, understand that, yes, you're a doctor and yes, you're providing this information, but, people must also want to come and talk to you about it, especially with, as you said, the sorts of horrors that happened concerning the lack of information on, SRHR. So, like, is there a sort of, like, line, I guess, in terms of being, Dr. Claire, the professional, and Dr. Claire, the personable person?
I don't think for me it's a conscious decision. It has been a conscious decision. It's just, I think my style of hosting is informed by who I am as a person. So because of my career and over the years, part of the training with medicine has been literally listening to the person in front of me and helping them feel heard and helping them feel safe enough to share really personal information. So I think I have almost always leaned on that with the guests I bring on set, because a lot of them, first of all, see the cameras and there's full panic. Like, if you guys saw what happens before we start shooting, like, okay, drink some water, breathe. Listen, I'm the nervous one. I promise you, it's not you. So there's a lot of that going on. And I think because of the rapport we have in the few minutes before we start shooting, it then translates on how the episode comes out. Because a lot of the feedback I'll get from guests is, oh my God, you made that so easy, or I can't believe I shared that, or I didn't expect it to be as conversational. I think they were expecting that the cameras, I feel like the lights and the cameras are overwhelming the conversation, but I prioritize the conversation. We barely, I think I speak to camera for the intro and the outro. We don't pay attention to the team the rest of the time. So I think that's how, my approach is just still an extension of medical practice and the training I have, because then I don't know any different when it comes to interviewing, because that's what being a doctor is. You come in to see me and I conduct an interview, I get your history, we work out what tests you need, we come up with a diagnosis, and then we work on a treatment plan that we work on as a team. So there's things I'll send you home to do, take your meds and blah, blah, there's follow-up I'm going to do, and every other visit. And so I sort of translate that the same way directly to hosting the podcast.
I also want to tell you, don't be fooled by the numbers on social media. Celebrity doesn't equal listens. They can be doing really well on the shorts. It does not translate to their podcast. So don't get intimidated by their presentation publicly. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's doing as well on the platforms or as many people are listening. A lot of times what we've seen in the industry is people who go in as professionals or as celebrities into the podcasting space lose people as they go, because I don't know you as a podcaster. I know you as a comedian or as whatever it is you're doing, musician, whatever it is, right? So I come on the first episode to figure out what you're doing, but not always stay, right? So don't let the celebrity intimidate you. A lot of people, and a lot of the data shows the people who end up celebrating in podcasting are people who just came into podcasting and then became podcast celebrities. So don't be intimidated by that.
Yeah. I can also add a bit, just from my own experience, that's very true, because when I started, I said, experiment. Now that you're starting, this is the best time, experiment as much as you can. When we started off, we hosted celebrities, just because, again, these are people already know, and so you don't know me. If I bring people that you know, it doesn't translate to listenership or viewership. The personal stories, the complete stranger who has the same narrative as me, those translate a lot better. So don't get, like she said, don't get intimidated by people's stats. And I also, personal advice as you're starting, don't pay attention to anyone else's stats. Your stats should inform you. And so you look at your own. I'm very introspective. I don't really care who else's numbers look like what, because again, even online, I've seen it doesn't translate, because I've done collaborations with enough celebrities versus us normal folk to know the value add. When you're talking about payments and money, it's not a direct translation. So experiment, make it your own, find your niche, find your audience, and then focus on your audience, focus on your numbers. If something is doing well, make it work and translate it across more episodes.
There's something you said that made me, I got a new question for you. When you're talking to your guests, do you run the final edit by them to see if they agree with it, or is it whatever we discussed, they can use any part of it?
So we have, again, doctor informed. We have a consent form that you'll sign before we shoot the episode. And then, because it's a podcast, it's a conversation. So I don't really do much editing. What you see is the conversation we had. So by the end of it, they're pretty comfortable. The only ones I've had come up and say, please leave this out, is if they named where they work. Okay. Those are the kind of ones that I'll get the feedback of, please just edit that out. But otherwise, the conversation flows. If it's an hour, it's an hour. If it's 40 minutes, it's 40 minutes. If you just refuse to talk to me, it's 5 minutes, sawa basi. We don't edit too much out of the conversation we have.
Okay. Any more questions? Going once. Okay, I don't see hands. She will still be here for at least 5 minutes, I say, before asking her. Anyway, if you have any questions on podcasting, Kevin is here. He has over 200 episodes and works with AfriPods. He can answer some questions. Angela is here. She works with AfriPods and has been in the space probably 4 years, if not more, so she can answer your questions. I'll be here as well. Dr. Claire, maybe for 5 minutes. I don't know how long she'll be here, but you can ask any questions you have in podcasting. Before you go, let us know where we can find you, Claire. It feels so weird calling you that. You, Dr. Claire, and where we can find your podcast.
So online, it's either at Dr. Claire Kinuthia or at CTRH podcast. I had team members for the longest time who didn't know what CTRH was. They thought that was the name, but it's Circling the Rabbit Hole podcast. But if you're looking for us online, it's at CTRH podcast. And this is, I think, on every platform. It's one of the 2 variations. On X, I don't even think there's need, just leave X alone. I barely, that's a platform that scares me, so I'm barely there.
I heard you talk about a website.
Yes, www.drclairekinuthia.com.
Excellent. Check, is it doctor as D-O-C?
DR.
Okay, just DR.
Yeah,
okay.
DR.
Check out our website, see what's happening when the newsletter comes, sign up for that. I have been your host. My name is Gadoni. You can find me at AfriPods on all social media platforms. We're on LinkedIn and we post. We're on LinkedIn, Facebook, X. We'll be there for a while. And Instagram. We're trying to figure out TikTok. Just follow us. We'll figure it out as we go. You can follow me, Podcasting in Africa, on all social media platforms. That's my personal profile. And my podcast is Okay Kiasi. Listen to it. Why not, you know? Anyway, thank you for being here, Dr. Claire. Thank you so much for making the time. It has been our last PodConnect for the year. Very special thank you to Baraza for hosting us for all our events. We would not have been able to do this without you. And to Semabox, because would we have videos on YouTube without them? No, the answer is no, okay? They're the best team. If you're looking to record your podcast, we were talking about places where you can record your podcast and have a professional team. Semabox is one of those spaces. They have, they're taking in podcasts as well. So if you go to their website, the name is Runway. Excellent, Runway on Semabox. If you check it out, you can fill a form and you can come and record. Then come and host it on AfriPods. We offer free hosting. Check out afripods.africa. If your podcast is not there, why?